This book is set in the early 1960s, a period with a lot of social and cultural tension. How did you approach depicting this era, and what unique challenges did that bring to the story?
Not that difficult. I was born in 1972, or 10 years after the events in this book. When you grow up black in America, especially when you have your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents around, they tell stories. Not just stories about family in your immediate area, but there are family that we have in the South, family we have in other areas that have stories that we tell and that we pass on. In 1962, both of my parents were teenagers. To hear both of them talk about the way things were then versus how they were a mere 20 years later in the 80s when I was in elementary, junior high, high school. My parents, especially when we had moved to a predominantly white suburb in New Jersey, that was a culture shock for my parents. My dad, not so much, because my dad had been in the military. My dad had worked in corporate environments, and like me, you're oftentimes the only black person or black male working in a company that is almost predominantly white. So, and my mother, being a teacher, she worked with white folks occasionally, but there was still a tremendous culture shock moving to the suburbs. And there's always been in this country this kind of like passive aggressive tension with certain demographics of white folks. But what makes it even more infuriating is when they act like there's no issue and there's no problem, and there clearly is. I grew up in a day and age where I would say something to someone and they would go out of their way to tell me how well I spoke and how articulate I was. And my question was always, as opposed to what? As opposed to who? And they wanted to go out of their way to tell me that they approved of the way that I spoke versus the way that they assume that black people do and would speak. Even though, again, if you know history, you'll realize that when Africans were brought to this country, none of them knew how to speak English. They learned English from white people. And depending on where they were brought into this country, you learned how to speak around the people who were speaking the most. And when you were talking about plantation life in the deep, deep South, black folks learned how to speak English from white folks. And over time, all of that broken English, that was the way white people spoke. And from there, basically, black folks remixed that dialect to what we're familiar with or more familiar with today. And there's always, every generation tweaks and remixes the dialect. So writing, it really was not difficult to convey the cultural tensions and all of those things, because when you live it, it's very easy to talk about. When you don't live it, you may feel a certain way about hearing about it or reading about it. Hopefully, when you are reading from someone else's point of view or trying to understand something from someone else's point of view, you allow yourself to be open to that possibility.